The stars outside the viewport had not changed in 6 hours. They never did. They just sat there, cold and distant, like old men who had seen everything and cared about none of it. Lieutenant Commander Yara Ose had stopped finding them beautiful about 2 years into her posting on the UES Dauntless. Now they were just background noise, white dots against black nothing. She was sitting at her communications console on the third shift, a cold cup of coffee beside her, when the buoy alert came in. It was not a dramatic alert. There was no red light, no blaring siren, no voice from the ceiling telling her the ship was in danger. It was a small yellow light on the far left corner of her screen, and a soft chime that sounded like someone tapping a glass with a spoon. Yara had heard that chime hundreds of times. It usually meant a relay station had picked up background radiation data, or that some merchant vessel was broadcasting its cargo manifest on the wrong frequency. She almost ignored it. But she had been sitting for 6 hours with nothing to do, and the yellow light was the most interesting thing that had happened since dinner. So she reached over and pulled up the signal. It was messy, broken up into fragments, like a message written on paper that had been torn into small pieces and mailed one piece at a time. The source was a deep space relay buoy sitting at the edge of the Cygnus arm, one of the older ones, barely maintained, the kind that the Galactic Cooperative had placed out there decades ago and mostly forgotten about. Yara opened the translation suite and let the computer begin working. The signal was not in any human language. That was not unusual. The buoys out in the Cygnus region picked up transmissions from dozens of species. She stretched her arms above her head, yawned, and waited. The translation came back partial, about 60% readable, but even 60% was enough to understand the basic shape of the message. It was a distress signal from somewhere called the Vreth Collective, a civilization Yara had heard of but knew almost nothing about. From what she remembered, they were a quiet species, peaceful, not really a military power. They made very good telescopes and traded them across the cooperative for food and materials. Nobody had ever really talked about them much, which usually meant they weren't causing trouble. The message said there was danger. It said they needed help. It asked for a response from any cooperative member within reach. Yara classified it as a Class 3 assistance request, the standard category for distress signals that were serious but not immediately catastrophic, and she forwarded it up the chain without much thought. It would go to Captain's review, then to Admiral Mekinen, then to Earth Command, where someone with more rank and more coffee than her would decide what to do about it. She poured her cold coffee into the recycler and made a fresh cup. What Yara did not know, what none of them knew, was that buried inside the fragmented signal, wrapped in an old layer of Vreth code that the translation suite had flagged as culturally archaic and low priority, was something else entirely. The Vreth had a distress system that was thousands of years old, back before the Galactic Cooperative existed, back when the Vreth were alone in their part of the galaxy, and sometimes found themselves facing things that were bigger and more dangerous than they were. They had developed a special code. It was called a cascade tag. It was not part of normal communication. It was not something a Vreth diplomat would ever attach to a routine message. A cascade tag was the thing you added when you had run out of options, when the walls were coming down, when you were not asking for a patrol ship or a diplomatic envoy. A cascade tag meant one thing: we are being destroyed. Send everything you have. The translation suite had found it, had flagged it, had placed it in the low-priority cultural archive queue because no one had told the system that a cascade tag was supposed to be treated differently from a decorative language artifact. The notation sat in a subfolder, waiting patiently, like a fire alarm covered by a coat. Admiral Edvard Mekinen reviewed the signal the next morning over breakfast. He was a large man with a broad face and white hair cut short, and he had served in Earth Space Forces for 31 years. He had seen real combat twice, paperwork 10,000 times, and he had a talent for knowing which signals mattered and which ones were going to sit on someone's desk for a month before anyone did anything. He read the Class 3 summary, noted that the Vreth Collective was in the Cygnus arm, noted that Earth had no permanent presence out there, and forwarded the signal to Earth Command with a recommendation that it be reviewed and routed to the nearest cooperative response unit. He finished his breakfast. He did not know about the Cascade tag, neither did anyone else on the Dauntless. The signal traveled from the Dauntless to the Deep Space Relay Network and arrived at Earth Command on Luna, the big gray rock that humanity had been building on for 2 centuries, approximately 4 hours later. Luna Command was a sprawling complex dug into the southern highlands, full of long corridors and humming server rooms and people walking fast with tablets in their hands. It processed thousands of signals every day. Most of them were routine. Most of them ended up handled by mid-level officers who were very good at being efficient and very good at not making waves. But Luna Command had, 6 months ago, finished installing a new translation and threat assessment system. It was called Ares 7. The people who built it were proud of it because it did not just translate. It understood context. It cross-referenced cultural databases. It looked at the whole picture of a message, not just the words. Ares 7 received the forwarded signal from the Dauntless at 3:12 hours, Luna Standard Time. It processed the Class 3 classification. Then it kept reading. It found the archived subfolder. It found the Cascade tag. It cross-referenced the Cascade tag against its cultural database, found 18 academic papers and 3 historical records describing its meaning and use, and it took all of 4 seconds to reach a conclusion. Then Ares 7 did something it had never done before, because it had never had a reason to do it before. It overrode the Class 3 classification and replaced it with something the Luna Command System had not displayed in 40 years. A solid red banner across every screen in the Strategic Operations Center, accompanied by an alert tone that the night shift staff had only ever heard in training drills. Officers looked up from their consoles. Someone knocked over a cup. A young ensign on his 3rd week of duty looked at the screen, looked at his senior officer beside him and said very quietly, "Is that real?" The senior officer was already on the comm to the Supreme Commander's office. The red banner on every screen said the same thing in large, clear letters. Extinction level threat DETACTAD. Cascade tag confirmed. VRETH collective system. Recommend immediate mobilization review. Down the hall in a secure briefing room, the heads of Earth's solar defense network began to arrive one by one, some still in their sleeping clothes, some already in uniform, all of them moving fast. Maps were pulled up. Star charts lit the walls. Someone pulled the file on the Vreth Collective, quiet species, peaceful, made telescopes, no military to speak of. Someone else pulled the file on what was capable of threatening them badly enough to send a Cascade tag. The room got very quiet. Outside, beyond the dome of Luna Command, the stars were just as cold and distant as they always were. But somewhere out in the dark, something was happening to a species that had asked, in the most desperate way they knew how, for help. Earth had heard them. And Earth, as it turned out, was not going to send a patrol ship. Supreme Commander Helena Voss had not slept in 22 hours when she walked into the Strategic Operations Center, but no one could tell by looking at her. She was the kind of person who seemed to run on something other than sleep, something colder and more reliable, like math. She was 61 years old, had commanded 3 fleet engagements in her career, and had once negotiated a ceasefire with a species that did not understand the concept of pausing. She was not easily surprised. She looked at the Cascade tag data for 4 minutes without speaking. Then she said, "Pull up Directive Omega 9. The room went very still. Directive Omega 9 was not a secret, exactly. It was written into the United Earth Council Charter. It was technically available to any citizen who knew where to look, but it sat in a part of the charter that most people never read. Buried under clauses about trade dispute arbitration and atmospheric regulation. It had been written after the Martian siege of 2201, a dark chapter in early human space history, when a communication breakdown had left 3 colonies undefended for 11 days, while politicians argued about jurisdiction. After the siege, someone had decided that there needed to be a rule, a single, clean rule. that allowed one person to skip the arguing when skipping the arguing was the only way to save lives. Directive Omega-9 gave the Supreme Commander of Earth's combined forces the authority to mobilize the entire Terran fleet without a council vote, without committee approval, without waiting for consensus. It required only two things: a confirmed extinction-level threat signal and the Supreme Commander's personal authorization code. Ares 7 had confirmed the Cascade tag as an extinction-level threat signal at 3:12 hours. It was now 3:47 hours. Helena Voss entered her authorization code at 3:48. What happened next was not loud. There was no single dramatic moment where alarms screamed and lights flashed and people ran down corridors in slow motion. What happened was quieter and in many ways far more frightening because it was organized. It was smooth. It was the sound of a machine that had been built to do exactly this and was now doing it. Across 17 star systems, encrypted command signals went out simultaneously. In the orbital docks above Earth, ships that had been sitting in maintenance rotation received priority override orders and began powering their drives. In the deep space patrol zones around Jupiter and Saturn, fleet elements changed course without a word of explanation to the commercial traffic around them. In the garrison bases on Titan and Ganymede, soldiers who had been eating breakfast or sleeping or playing cards looked at their mission alerts and started moving. The Terran combined fleet, all of it, had been given a single order: converge, assemble, and be ready to fold into FTL within 6 hours. In the Galactic Cooperative's regional hub station, a cooperative communications officer named Selvroth, a tall, thin being with 4 arms and very good hearing, was reviewing the morning traffic reports when something unusual appeared on his screen. It was an automated manifest notification from Earth Command. Standard procedure when Earth vessels were traveling through cooperative space was to file a movement report. This kept traffic lanes clear and prevented misunderstandings. Selvroth opened the manifest. He stared at it for a very long time. The manifest listed 4,412 vessels, warships, all classes, ranging from light frigates to heavy cruisers to carrier groups. At the very bottom of the list, listed almost casually among the others, were 3 designations that made Selvroth's 4 hands go very cold: TCS Aegis, TCS Olympus, TCS Leviathan, the Titan-class supercarriers. The ones that most of the cooperative had assumed were, at best, exaggerated. Ships the humans talked about in budget documents and military reviews, but that no one outside of Earth had ever actually confirmed existed in operational form. They existed. Selvroth sent an urgent message to his supervisor. His supervisor sent an urgent message to the regional director. The regional director looked at the manifest and then sat down heavily in his chair and said nothing for almost a minute. Then the regional director sent an urgent message to the Galactic Cooperative High Council, because this was the kind of thing that required the High Council to know about immediately, even if, especially if, there was absolutely nothing the High Council could do about it. Meanwhile, the Vreth ambassador to the Galactic Cooperative, a gentle and soft-spoken individual named Prav, was in his office trying to draft a follow-up message to his distress signal. He had sent the signal 9 days ago, when the Krath warships had first entered Vreth space. He had not expected a fast response. Nothing in the cooperative moved fast. He had hoped that within a few weeks, perhaps a month, some diplomatic vessels might arrive to open talks. He had hoped the Krath might agree to negotiate. He had tried very hard to remain calm. He received an automated notification from Earth Command at 9:31 hours. It contained the same manifest that had made Selvroth go cold. Prav read it 3 times. He looked up the Titan-class supercarriers in his database. The entry was flagged as unconfirmed, possibly theoretical, and then looked back at the manifest where all 3 of them were listed by name with operational status codes. He put his head down on his desk. He was not sad. He was not afraid. He was experiencing an emotion that the Vreth language had a word for, but that translated imperfectly into galactic standard. Something close to overwhelming, unexpected relief arriving so suddenly that it feels like a physical weight being removed from your body all at once. He stayed that way for several minutes. On the bridge of the UES Dauntless, Admiral Edvard Mekinen had just been briefed on what his routine forwarded signal had caused. He was quiet for a long time after the briefing officer finished speaking. He looked at the star charts. He looked at the fleet assembly data. He counted the ships. He stopped counting at 300 because the number was already too large to feel real, and there were more than 4,000 of them. He had forwarded a Class 3 signal, standard procedure. He had not known about the cascade tag. He had not known that buried in the signal was a cry so desperate it had triggered a response that no one in the Galactic Cooperative had ever seen before, and that most of them had not believed was possible. "Do we know," he said carefully to his briefing officer, "what exactly we're flying into?" "Not fully, sir. We know the Krath Dominion is involved. We're pulling everything we have on them now." Mekinen nodded. He had heard of the Krath. Most people in Earth's military had. They were the kind of empire that left footprints dead planets, absorbed civilizations, the occasional species that simply ceased to exist in the historical record. They had been active in the Cygnus Arm for a long time. No one had ever seriously pushed back against them, because pushing back required being willing to pay the cost, and the cooperative as a whole had never quite been willing to pay it. "How long until the fleet is assembled and ready for FTL jump?" he asked. 4 hours and 40 minutes, sir." "And after that?" 18 hours of travel to the Vreth system." Mekinen looked out the viewport at the stars. Somewhere out there, a quiet people who made telescopes were facing something they could not survive alone. They had sent a signal into the dark. They had used the oldest, most desperate code their civilization had ever created. Earth had heard it. And in less than 23 hours, the Krath Dominion was going to see something that no empire in the Cygnus Arm had ever seen before. The full weight of what humanity had quietly been building for the past 200 years, pointed in one direction, moving at once. The fleet assembled, the drives powered up, the FTL corridors opened. And Earth went. Warlord Dureth had conquered 11 systems in his career, and he had never once worried about a counterattack he had not already planned for. He was a large being. The Krath were all large, built wide and heavy, with thick gray skin and small black eyes that missed very little. He had earned his rank through 40 years of campaigns, and he had learned that the universe rewarded patience and preparation and overwhelming force applied at exactly the right moment. He was not cruel for the pleasure of it. He was efficient. The Vreth Collective represented resources his empire needed. Their system had 3 mineral-rich planets, 2 of which were barely inhabited. The Vreth themselves were not fighters. They would resist briefly, and then they would accept the reality of the situation, as everyone eventually did. He had given them 9 days to understand their situation. He was standing on the bridge of his flagship, the Dominion's Will, reviewing the pacification schedule for the Vreth home planet, when his sensor officer made a sound that Dureth had never heard from the young officer before, a sharp intake of breath, followed by silence. "Report," Dureth said, without looking up from his tablet. The sensor officer did not immediately respond. This was unusual. The officer was well trained. The officer did not pause. "Report," Dureth said again, louder this time, and now he looked up. The sensor officer was staring at his screen with the expression of someone who had seen something that their mind was still trying to fit into a category that made sense. He turned to Dureth slowly and said, in a voice that was almost a whisper, "FTL exits, Warlord." "Multiple. I am reading multiple FTL exits at the system boundary." "How many?" The officer looked at his screen again. He pressed 2 buttons, running a verification check because the number he was seeing could not be right. The verification confirmed it. He looked back at Dureth. "All of them, sir," he said, which was not a real answer but was the only one he had. "All of the contacts. There are too many to give you a single number quickly." Dureth crossed the bridge in 4 long strides and looked at the sensor display himself. The edge of the Vreth system was lighting up. FTL exit signatures. the distinctive gravitational bloom that large ships left when they dropped out of faster-than-light travel, were appearing across the display. One after another, a chain of them, dozens becoming hundreds, the sensor display struggling to render individual contacts and beginning to show them in clusters instead, because there were simply too many individual markers to draw. Durath had been in battles. He had seen fleet engagements. He understood, in the part of his brain that processed military reality, that what he was looking at was a problem. But the part of his brain that had spent 40 years being the most powerful military force in this region of the galaxy was having trouble accepting what the sensors were telling him. He watched for 30 seconds. The exit signatures kept coming. He looked at his fleet count. He had brought 47 warships to the Vreth system. 47 was more than enough. It was always more than enough. What was arriving on the far side of the system was not 47 ships. It was not 400 ships. The Krath sensor system, which was excellent and very accurate, eventually resolved the incoming contacts into a number that a communications officer read aloud from his station in a flat, mechanical voice, because reading numbers was easier than thinking about what they meant. 4,412 vessels. Warships. Terran designation. The bridge of the Dominion's will was quiet for a long moment. Then a transmission arrived. Durath's comm officer routed it to the main speaker without being asked, because it was being broadcast on every open frequency in the system, and there was no stopping it from being heard. The voice that came through was calm. It was not angry. It was not excited. It was the voice of a man who was describing the weather, pleasant, matter-of-fact, completely certain of what he was saying. This is Admiral Edvard Mekinen of the United Earth ship Dauntless, speaking on behalf of the Terran Combined Fleet. You are operating in a system that has requested Earth's assistance. You have 30 minutes to begin a full withdrawal of all Krath vessels from this system. After 30 minutes, we will no longer be talking. This message will not be repeated. The transmission ended. Durath stared at the speaker for a moment. Then he looked at the sensor display again. 4,000 ships. He ran the math. He could not help it. It was what his mind did, and the math was very clear. He could not win this engagement. The numbers were not close. They were not even in the same conversation. But 40 years of being the most feared military force in the Cygnus arm had built something inside Durath that was difficult to set aside in 30 minutes. He told himself that the humans were bluffing. He told himself that no force that large would engage a smaller enemy, that the political cost was too high, that there would be negotiations, that there was always negotiation. He did not order a withdrawal. The 30 minutes passed. The human fleet moved. It did not move the way Durath expected a fleet to move. He had seen large fleets fight before. They formed lines. They picked targets. They advanced in organized waves, protecting their largest ships, using the smaller ones as screens. There was a shape to how military forces fought, a predictable grammar that every spacefaring species had independently developed, because physics and tactics pushed you toward the same solutions. The human fleet did not do that. It split, not into 2 groups or 3, it fragmented into dozens of independent strike forces, each one moving at a different angle, each one hitting a different part of the Krath formation simultaneously. Fast frigates went wide and came in from behind. Carrier groups pushed straight through the center. Heavy cruisers targeted Krath command vessels specifically, ignoring everything else around them. It was like being attacked by water. It found every gap, every weakness, every undefended angle all at once. Durath's fleet fought back. His ships were good ships. His crews were experienced. They were not incompetent, but every decision they made to respond to one attack opened them up to another, and the humans shifted and changed and adapted faster than any force Durath had ever seen. A Krath destroyer moved to support a flanked cruiser, and a human frigate was already there, as if it had known. A Krath carrier tried to pull back to a defensive position, and 3 human ships came at it from angles that should have been impossible given their last known positions. And the humans did not stop. They did not pause to reassess. They did not slow down when they took hits. A human cruiser took a direct strike to its port side, and instead of falling back, it turned into the attack, closed the range to almost nothing, and fired at point blank. A frigate captain whose FTL drive had been destroyed by Krath fire used her ship's remaining momentum to ram directly into the engine section of a Krath heavy cruiser. Then her crew ejected in pods, and she came over the comms laughing, actually laughing. And Dureth heard it because the channel was open and he could not understand it, could not fit it into any framework he had for how soldiers behaved. 4 hours and 17 minutes after the first shot was fired, Dureth looked at his sensor display and saw that he had 19 ships left. He had started with 47. He ordered a retreat. The Krath ships that could still move began making FTL jumps. Some of them did not make it. Most of them did. Dureth's flagship was the last to go, and in the final seconds before his FTL drive engaged, he looked one more time at the sensor display, at the human fleet settling into formation around the Vreth home planet, already moving to secure the system, already broadcasting assistance signals to the Vreth population on the surface. They had not chased him, they had let him go. He did not know if that was mercy or if they simply did not need to. Both options were troubling in different ways. His FTL engaged. The Vreth system disappeared behind him. In the silence of his bridge, surrounded by officers who were all looking at their consoles and not at each other, Dureth drafted a message to Krath High Command. He had written many messages in his life. He had written reports of victories. He had once written a report of a defeat, one in 40 years, a small engagement early in his career against a species that had surprised him before he had surprised them. This message was different from all of them. He wrote, "Do not engage the humans. Do not provoke the humans. Whatever intelligence we have on their military capabilities, consider it worthless. They do not fight the way any species fights. They do not have limits where limits are supposed to be. The force they sent was not proportional. It was not a message. It was a fact. They came with everything they had for a species they had never met because someone asked. Think carefully about what that means. I am." He sent the message. Then he sat in his command chair, in the quiet of his bridge, and thought about a frigate captain floating in an escape pod, laughing. He thought about it for a very long time. The Galactic Cooperative Emergency Summit was called 6 days after the Battle of Cygnus Reach. It was held on Meridian Station, a massive orbital platform that sat at the center of cooperative space, built specifically for moments like this one, though no one had imagined that a moment quite like this one would ever actually happen. The station's great assembly hall could seat representatives from 80 species simultaneously, and on the morning the summit opened, 73 of those seats were filled. The remaining 7 species had either sent messages explaining they were monitoring the situation carefully, which meant they were too nervous to commit to any position publicly, or had simply not responded at all, which meant they were even more nervous than that. The hall was louder than it usually was. That was the first sign that something had genuinely shaken people. The cooperative's assembly meetings were normally structured and orderly, with a kind of polite, bureaucratic calm that had been built up over centuries of careful diplomacy. Species that had once been enemies sat next to each other and spoke in careful, measured tones, because the alternative, actual open conflict, was something the cooperative existed specifically to prevent. But on that morning, the calm was missing. Species were talking to each other across the aisles. Delegations were huddled in whispered conversations. The noise level was something that the hall's senior moderator, a 400-year-old Ethon named Delegate Prin, found deeply alarming before he had even reached his podium. He reached it. He called the summit to order. He gave a short opening statement about the importance of measured response and careful consideration, and then he opened the floor. What followed was 3 hours of the most intense debate the cooperative assembly had seen in living memory. And in a room where some members had memories stretching back 3 centuries, that was saying something. Most of the first hour was consumed by species who were frightened, not of the Krath, though some of them mentioned the Krath, but of humanity. They spoke about the scale of the response. They used words like disproportionate and unilateral and dangerous precedent. They pointed out correctly that Earth had not consulted the cooperative before mobilizing. Earth had not asked for authorization. Earth had not sent a preliminary diplomatic vessel. Earth had received a distress signal, decoded a cultural artifact that predated the cooperative itself, and then simply deployed its entire military force as if that were a normal and obvious thing to do. One delegate, a short, round-bodied being from the Pelian Union who was normally very quiet in these meetings, stood up and said, with genuine distress in his voice, that Earth's action had demonstrated a military capacity that no one in the cooperative had known about, and that this was itself a kind of threat, because a species with power that large and that hidden was a species that had been, at best, not fully transparent with its partners. Several other delegates applauded this point. Delegate Prin of the Ethon Collective gave the longest speech of the morning. The Ethon were one of the oldest species in the cooperative, and Prin was their most senior diplomat, tall, angular, with a voice that carried naturally across large spaces without needing amplification. He spoke for 40 minutes. He talked about the foundation principles of the cooperative, about collective decision-making, about the danger of any single species acting alone on a scale large enough to reshape galactic power structures. He talked about checks and balances. He talked about history, about empires that had told themselves they were acting for good reasons when they marched into other people's systems uninvited. He did not call humanity an empire. He was too careful a diplomat for that. But the shape of what he was saying was clear enough that the delegates who were paying attention understood it perfectly. The hall was quiet when he finished. It was the kind of quiet that meant people were thinking. Then Earth's representative stood up. Minister Fatima al-Rashid was not a dramatic person. She was 64 years old, had spent 30 of those years in diplomatic postings on 7 different worlds, and had the specific kind of calm that belongs to people who have been in very difficult rooms for a very long time and have learned that the worst thing you can do in a difficult room is perform. She did not use the main podium. She spoke from her seat, which was permitted under cooperative rules, and which also happened to mean that the hall's audio system carried her voice exactly as it was: quiet, clear, and completely steady. She let the silence sit for a moment after she stood. Then she spoke. "I want to say something simple," she said, "and I want to say it plainly because I think the plainest version of it is the most honest version." She paused. "You built a community that responds to extinction-level threats with committee meetings. The Vreth sent a cascade tag, your own ancient code created by one of your own member species, recognized in the cultural database of every cooperative member for total annihilation. We received that signal, we confirmed it, we acted on it, and we are standing here today because the Vreth are still alive to be argued about." Another pause. "If that frightens you, I understand. I'm not asking you not to be frightened, but I want you to be frightened of the right thing, not of us. Of the fact that a cascade tag was sent and no one except us treated it as what it was. Of the fact that the Vreth could have disappeared entirely and the cooperative's official response would have arrived at the earliest 3 weeks later in the form of a diplomatic inquiry." She sat down. The hall was still for almost 10 full seconds. In a room with 73 different species, 10 seconds of complete silence was remarkable. Then Ambassador Prav of the Vreth Collective, who had been sitting in the back of the hall very quietly since the summit opened, stood up. He was a small being, the Vreth generally were, with soft gray-brown coloring and very large, gentle eyes. He had not spoken yet that morning. He spoke now. He did not give a speech. He said only this: "We sent that signal because we were dying and we did not know what else to do. We did not expect what came. We did not know it was possible. We are alive because it was." He paused. "Thank you seems like a very small word, but it is the one we have." He sat back down. The applause started from somewhere in the middle of the hall. You're a delegate section. Species from the outer rim who had always had complicated feelings about the cooperative's slow response systems. It spread. Not unanimously, Prin of the Ethon did not applaud, and several others held back, but it spread through the hall like a slow wave, growing louder than it had started, and it continued for a long time. Delegate Prin watched it with an expression that was difficult to read. He had been in this hall for 214 years. He had seen many things shift. He recognized the feeling in the room, the way an argument, carefully made and logically sound, could still lose to a simpler truth delivered at the right moment. He did not agree with what had happened. He was still not sure it was safe. He was still not sure that a species capable of deploying 4,000 warships in 6 hours was a species that could be trusted with that kind of power indefinitely. But he also, and this was the thing he would think about for a very long time afterward, he also could not find a version of the last 2 weeks where the Vreth survived without what Earth had done. Outside Meridian Station, in the wider galaxy, other things were happening that the summit was not fully focused on. Human engineers had arrived in the Vreth system 2 days after the battle and had begun helping repair the damage the Krath bombardment had done to Vreth infrastructure. Human doctors were on the surface. Human supply ships had offloaded food, medicine, building materials. No one had asked Earth to do this. No cooperative directive had authorized it. Earth had simply looked at a civilization that needed help and continued helping it, because the battle was one part of the answer, and the other part was everything that came after. A cooperative oversight team that arrived to monitor the situation sent back a report, nodding, with some bewilderment, that the human military forces were sharing meals with Vreth civilians, that human soldiers were helping clear rubble from collapsed buildings in their off hours, that a human medical officer had apparently spent an entire night learning enough Vreth language to explain a treatment procedure to a child's parent rather than rely on a translation device, because someone had told her the parents were scared of machines. The oversight team did not know what to do with this information, so they reported it exactly as they had observed it and let the council decide what to think. The council read the report. Several members read it twice. It did not make Earth less complicated. It did not make the power imbalance less real, but it added something to the picture that Delegate Prin's careful 40-minute speech had not quite accounted for, something that was harder to argue with than politics or precedent. The meeting adjourned without a formal resolution. This was, in the history of the Galactic Cooperative, the loudest possible way of saying, "We don't know what to do with you yet." Earth's delegation flew home. Minister Al-Rashid slept for 12 hours on the transport back, which was the most she had slept in a week. She did not feel like she had won anything. She felt like she had told the truth, and that the truth had been heard. And that this was enough for today. Tomorrow would bring more questions. It always did. 3 months after the Battle of Cygnus Reach, the galaxy had not forgotten what happened. It was the kind of event that settled into the memory of every species that had heard about it, the way a very loud sound settles into a room long after the noise has stopped. A kind of ringing in the ears that reminds you something large occurred, even when things have gone quiet again. The Krath Dominion was quiet. That by itself was unusual. The Krath were rarely quiet. They moved. They expanded. They applied pressure in one direction or another because that was what empires did. They pushed until something pushed back. But the Krath had pulled their fleets back from the Cygnus Arm entirely. Their border stations near Vreth space had gone dark. Their communications, normally confident and full of the kind of language that reminded everyone they were speaking to a power that was used to winning, had become minimal and careful. In Krath High Command, Warlord Dureth sat before an investigation council that had spent 6 weeks reviewing the battle data from the Vreth system. Dureth had been in front of this council before, after his one previous defeat early in his career, and he remembered how that had gone. Questions, pressure, the search for someone to blame. He had expected the same this time. But it was different this time. The council was not angry. The council was subdued. They had all seen the sensor data. They had all watched the recording of 4,000 human ships dropping out of FTL and moving like one living thing rather than a collection of vessels. They had all done the math, the same math Dureth had done on that bridge, and reached the same conclusion. "Tell us," said the Council Primus, the oldest and highest-ranked member, a veteran of 30 campaigns of his own, "in your opinion, What would have happened if we had sent a larger force? If we had anticipated resistance? Dureth had thought about this question before the council asked it. He had been thinking about it for 3 months. It would have made no difference, he said. Not at the numbers we could realistically send. The problem was not how many ships we had. The problem was that we did not know what they were. He paused. We had intelligence reports, records from other species. We thought we understood human military capacity. We were wrong by an order of magnitude, but the number of ships was not the most important thing. Another pause, longer this time. The most important thing was that they fought without a ceiling. Every species I have engaged has a point at which the calculation changes, a point where they weigh what they are losing against what they might win and begin to slow down, to reassess, to protect what remains. He looked at the council. The humans do not appear to have that point, or if they do, we did not find it. We did not come close to finding it. The council primus wrote something down. The room was quiet. And the casualty figures, the primus said, for the human fleet. 3 ships damaged, no ships lost, approximately 40 personnel casualties. Dureth said the numbers the way you say numbers that do not make sense flatly, without inflection, because adding any expression to them would only make them seem more unreal. We lost 28 ships. We began with 47. No one spoke for a moment. The standing directive, Dureth said without being asked, should be clear. Do not engage the humans. Do not threaten the humans. Do not place military assets within 2 systems of any world currently under their protection. And most importantly, he looked up from the table, and his small black eyes moved from face to face around the council. Do not make any species with human contact feel desperate enough to call for their help, because they will come. That is the thing we did not understand and that we must not forget. They will actually come. The council took 2 more days to write its formal report. The conclusion was not the one that any of them would have written a year ago before Cygnus Reach. But it was the honest conclusion, and the Krath, whatever their faults, had always respected honest conclusions. The word they used in their own language translated roughly as, leave them alone. On the other side of the galaxy, in the Cooperative's Central Research Archive, a diplomat named Ambassador Suveth was writing a different kind of document. He had been given the task of composing the Cooperative's formal assessment of humanity's status, a reclassification review that would determine how Earth was officially categorized in the Cooperative's membership hierarchy. It was the kind of paperwork that sounded bureaucratic but was actually quite serious, because category determined things like how much influence a species had in votes, how their military forces were treated in joint operations, and how other species were advised to engage with them diplomatically. Suveth had been working on the document for 2 months. He had read everything the Cooperative's archives had on humanity, 300 years of observations, reports, trade records, diplomatic transcripts, and the occasional alarmed memo from a species that had negotiated with a human trader and come away feeling like they had been out-talked in a language they thought they were fluent in. He had also read the battle records from Cygnus Reach 47 times. He had watched the sensor recordings. He had reviewed the human fleet's tactical data, some of which they had voluntarily shared with the Cooperative as part of the transparency measures Minister Al-Rashid had proposed in the summit's aftermath. He had read the report from the Cooperative Oversight Team about human soldiers sharing meals with Vreth civilians, and a medical officer spending a night learning Vreth language, so a parent would not be afraid. He had stared at the classification options in the cooperative system for a long time. None of them fit. Military power was too narrow. Regional hegemon had the wrong implications. Peacekeeping member was wildly inadequate. He had finally gone back to the cooperative's founding documents, found a category that had been written into the original charter and never used, and decided that the people who had written the charter had perhaps imagined something like this, even if they had not expected it to arrive from this particular direction. The category was anchor species. The definition in the charter read, a civilization whose presence within a given region fundamentally and persistently affects the stability and behavior of that region, rendering conventional power calculations secondary to the fact of their existence there. Suveth had added his own note to the official recommendation. The primary misunderstanding the cooperative has maintained regarding humanity is that they are a military power that chooses at times to act peacefully. This assessment is incorrect. They are a protective species that has built a military because the universe required it of them. The distinction matters. An empire expands until stopped. A protector is still until called. The Vreth called. We saw the result. The correct question is not whether to be concerned about what humans can do. The correct question is whether we are comfortable being the kind of community that makes them feel they need to do it alone. He sent the document to the council. He did not know if they would accept the recommendation. He suspected they would argue about it for at least a year. That was all right. The document was written, and once something was written clearly enough, it had a way of eventually being understood. On Vreth Prime, 3 months after the battle, a 7-year-old Vreth girl named Senna was watching a human soldier clear rubble from what had been a community building, before the Krath bombardment had taken out the eastern wall. The soldier was a young man, 23, though Senna did not know this from Nairobi, and he worked with the steady, unhurried focus of someone who had decided that this was the task in front of him, and that the task deserved to be done properly. Senna had been watching humans for 3 months. They fascinated her. They were the right size to seem approachable, but built with a kind of physical density that she had learned to associate with creatures that were used to doing hard physical things. They laughed a lot. They argued with each other, and then seemed to forget they had argued. They played games in their off hours that involved running and jumping for no clear practical reason, which Senna found very interesting. This one had noticed her watching. He had smiled at her. Humans showed teeth when they were happy, which had taken Senna a while to understand was not a threat, and gone back to work. She walked a little closer. The Vreth were naturally cautious, but 3 months of this had worn her caution down. She stopped a few feet away and watched him lift a piece of broken wall that was easily twice her weight. "Why did you come?" she asked. Her galactic standard was school-level, careful, and a little slow. The soldier set down the piece of wall. He looked at her, and his expression was the one that humans made when they were thinking about how to say something. She had learned that expression. It meant they were being honest, not just polite. "You asked," he said. Senna considered this. It seemed like a very short answer for a very large question. "But we asked everyone," she said. "We sent the signal everywhere." "I know," he said. "The others didn't come." He nodded, and something moved across his face that she did not have a word for, not sadness, exactly, but something adjacent to it, like the feeling of a weight you had been carrying for a long time without noticing it. "I know that too," he said. He picked up another piece of rubble. She watched him work for a while. Then she went home for dinner and she thought about his answer all through the meal and all through the quiet before she fell asleep. "You asked." She turned it over and looked at it from different angles, the way she did with the telescope pieces her parents made in their workshop. She could not see all of it yet. She was 7. But she kept the answer somewhere she would not forget it, because she had the feeling, not quite formed yet into words, that it was the kind of answer that took time to understand fully. She thought she might still be thinking about it when she was grown. The UES Dauntless was 3 weeks out from the Vreth system, heading back toward the Inner Fleet Assembly Point, when Admiral Edvard Mekinen finally sat down alone in his ready room with a cup of coffee, and the full after-action report spread across his desk. He had been putting this off. There were always things to put it off for: briefings and reports and comm calls, and the 1,000 small administrative duties of commanding a ship that was part of the largest fleet deployment in Earth's history. But now the ship was on a quiet heading, the night shift was on the bridge, and the corridors were mostly empty, and there was no good reason left to keep not doing this. He read the report. It was thorough. It covered the battle in full detail: tactics, casualties, outcomes. It covered the diplomatic aftermath. It covered the ongoing relief operations on Vreth Prime. At the very end, as a historical appendix, someone had attached a full transcription of the original distress signal from the relay buoy, including the cascade tag, translated completely now that Ares 7 had been given time to do a proper job of it. Mekanon read the Cascade tag translation 3 times. He thought about the yellow light on Yara Osai's console, the soft chime like a spoon tapping glass. He thought about how close it had come, how many things had to go exactly right for the signal to reach the right system, be flagged by the right AI, be read by the right people quickly enough to matter. He thought about the fact that the Cascade tag had been sitting in a low-priority archive subfolder because no one had told the old classification system that it was important. He thought about the Vreth. About Senna, though he did not know her name, he had seen children in the footage from the surface, small and gray-brown and watching the human soldiers with those very large eyes. He thought about how those children had almost not existed anymore, had almost been a historical footnote, a species that made telescopes, absorbed into an empire, slowly erased. He closed the report. He opened a new document. He typed slowly and deliberately, because he had learned over 31 years that the things worth saying were worth saying with care. The standing order he wrote was not long. It would go to Luna Command, and from there into Earth's fleet-wide protocols, and from there into the training documents that every new communications officer would read at the start of their posting. All distress signals are high priority, all of them. This is not a triage system. We do not assess who is worth saving before we finish reading the message. We read the message. We respond. Every time. He signed it, he sent it. Then he sat back in his chair and looked out at the stars, cold, old, patient, full of things happening in the dark that no one could see yet, full of signals traveling slowly towards someone who might or might not be listening. Earth would be listening. Somewhere out there, another signal was already on its way. And this time they were ready.